Dear
Bom dia.
dia a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos à Portugal Renewable Energy Summit 2025, uma iniciativa da APREN, a Associação Portuguesa de Energias Renováveis. Eu sou o Diogo Carvalheda, sou responsável de comunicação e eventos da APREN e vou ser o vosso host nos próximos 2 dias, nesta conferência que é já um clássico do setor. De facto, já contamos com quase 15 anos de história, uma história que é feita a várias mãos, de várias equipas da APREN, de vários atores do setor e de vários atores. Gostaria também de dar os parabéns à pessoa que me está a ligar neste momento. A PRES é hoje a principal conferência dedicada ao setor das energias renováveis em Portugal e um ponto de encontro para a partilha de conhecimento e networking. Neste evento reúnem-se então as principais entidades públicas, governamentais e privadas para debater as mais recentes novidades do setor em matéria de políticas, regulação, investigação e desenvolvimento e estratégia. Esta é uma história da qual vocês também fazem parte, os que nos visitam a primeira vez este ano e a grande maioria que repete ano após ano a sua passagem aqui por este evento. Ao longo de todos estes anos já tivemos muita coisa, já tivemos muitas promessas, já tivemos declarações bombásticas, já tivemos a presença de ativistas climáticos, portanto têm sido anos cheios de animação. Nós não sabemos exatamente o que é que os próximos 2 dias nos reservam, sabemos qual é que é o nosso objetivo, contudo, sabemos que queremos passar um retrato exato, realista deste que é o nosso setor. Vamos começar primeiro com o enquadramento europeu, toda a legislação europeia dos últimos tempos. Passamos depois para o ambiente ibérico e depois afunilamos para a realidade portuguesa. Sabemos que as oportunidades do setor são mais que muitas. Sabemos também que os constrangimentos também são muitos e é isso mesmo que vamos mostrar nestes 2 dias, analisando em conjunto o caminho até 2030, ano que, como sabemos, não sei se têm olhado para o calendário, mas aproxima-se vertiginosamente. Quando digo que vamos fazer isto em conjunto, é mesmo em conjunto, isto porque o evento tem uma aplicação de suporte à qual podem aceder usando este grande QR Code que está aqui atrás de mim ou, vou-vos facilitar a vida, está na parte de trás do vosso badge, também se não quiserem estar de telemóvel em punho. Através desta aplicação podem consultar o programa, podem falar com os restantes participantes e com os restantes oradores e podem participar ativamente nos painéis da conferência, deixando perguntas, participando também nas nossas sondagens. Temos 2 por dia, uma de manhã e outra à tarde, portanto, pedia-vos que fossem respondendo para também nós recolhermos as vossas opiniões. Sobre o programa, já não consigo ver isto, estou a ficar mais velho, vou ter que usar aqui este grande. Então, começamos aqui com a abertura, que é onde estamos neste momento. Passamos depois para a evolução global das renováveis e respectivas tendências, um coffee break. Temos depois o papel do Clean Industrial Deal na transição energética da União Europeia, o almoço e depois aqui uma tarde cheia de temas. Readiness 2030, o futuro do mercado ibérico de eletricidade, um painel sobre offshore, já tem sido um clássico nos últimos tempos, e um tema que se tem revelado cada vez mais importante nos últimos tempos, o papel do reequipamento na transição energética. Vão calar, vou deixar falar quem sabe e vou chamar desde já o Presidente da APREN, que já está aqui a levantar-se, para deixar o seu discurso de boas-vindas. Muito obrigado. Até já.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Isto começa a ser uma tradição de todos os anos, ou antes da COP ou depois da COP, fazemos a conferência. Sejam muito bem-vindas e muito bem-vindos ao nosso evento. É um gosto receber-vos aqui em nome da APREN. Acho que o setor continua a evoluir e a vossa representatividade aqui assim o demonstra. Queria só deixar aqui uma pequena nota, porque há várias discussões e vamos puxar a base à nossa sardinha de qual é efetivamente o grande evento de energia em Portugal, e obviamente que é este, não é? Por isso é que vocês estão todos aqui e vamos ter, expectavelmente, praticamente 600 pessoas. Quero também fazer um conjunto só de agradecimentos aos oradores e aos moderadores por disponibilizarem o seu tempo para estar aqui connosco estes 2 dias. Um agradecimento, obviamente, aos nossos patrocinadores, para além de serem nossos associados, também nos ajudam na estruturação financeira deste importante evento para o país. Um agradecimento a toda a equipa que ajudou a montar isto, dos nossos, no fundo, contratados e empresas que nos apoiam na gestão deste processo. Agradecer, obviamente, à nossa massa crescente de associados. Felizmente, continuamos a aumentar o número de associados todos os anos. Isso é um bom sinal, significa que Portugal está no sentido certo da sua transição energética. E, obviamente, quero agradecer também, como faço todos os anos, à equipa da APREN, que é responsável por pôr este evento em pé, como se costuma dizer, e o seu incansável trabalho, empenho e desempenho no desenvolvimento desta atividade. Posto isto, normalmente eu faço uma abertura um pouco mais longa, mas tendo em conta a quantidade de oradores que vamos ter e a quantidade de conteúdos que queremos partilhar convosco, só vos quero deixar uma nota relevante antes de passar ao nosso próximo orador. O que a gente vai abordar neste evento é claramente o papel da energia renovável na transição energética, mas não só. E nós temos discutido isto em sede da APREN e o que nós pensamos que hoje está presente são os 6 pilares das energias renováveis e da transição energética. Isto começou por ser um tema climático, no fundo, redução de emissões como forma de combate às alterações climáticas, mas temos que integrar também que o tema das centrais eletroprodutoras renováveis podem ser um polo de desenvolvimento de biodiversidade e de proteção dos ecossistemas, como hoje vocês vão poder ter a oportunidade de ver casos concretos e não estudos ou apreciações ou futurologias sobre o que poderá ser. E, portanto, vamos ver efetivamente casos concretos de o que é que foi feito numa central eletroprodutora e como é que a biodiversidade está a ser tida em linha de conta e como não há redução, há manutenção das populações e é um facto que nos vai trazer aqui uma visão distinta. Obviamente que todos nós já vimos pelo Clean Energy Industry Deal e o Affordable Energy Action Plan, desculpem-me o anglicismo, mas um dos grandes papéis da energia renovável, da eletrificação dos consumos e da integração da cadeia de valor é, efetivamente, conseguirmos aumentar a competitividade das indústrias na Europa através de ter custos de energia mais confortáveis e mais baixos e, obviamente, um tratamento da forma como os custos de rede vão à tarifa dos clientes para que Portugal também esteja em linha com aquilo que se faz, como no caso da Alemanha e no caso de Espanha e França. Outro ponto fundamental, tendo em conta o enquadramento geopolítico onde estamos, segurança de abastecimento só pode ser, no fundo, garantida se conseguirmos, efetivamente, ter a obtenção dos energéticos, no fundo, vou utilizar aqui a produção de energia em solo europeu, nos Estados-membros, porque essa é a única forma que nós temos de controlar a disponibilidade, a quantidade, o custo e não estarmos sujeitos a flutuações geopolíticas com especulação concreta em termos de commodities. E, obviamente, que as renováveis vão-nos trazer mais 2 vetores importantes. A independência e a soberania energética, mas não só, um tema de soberania política, porque, efetivamente, repito, no quadro geopolítico que nós nos estamos a aproximar, assegurar que temos capacidade de subsistir nas nossas atividades, controlando ao máximo possível a energia disponível que temos para os nossos consumos, é absolutamente fundamental. Posto isto, desejo-vos um excelente dia de trabalho, na expectativa que vocês deem por bem emprego o tempo que vão aqui passar. Muito obrigado e até já.
Gostaria agora de chamar o Secretário de Estado de Energia, Jean Barroca, para fazer a sua intervenção. Obrigado.
Não sei se vai sendo comum na política, mas alguém deixou o telemóvel aqui e uns cigarros. Não, mas eu... Bom dia a todos e deixem-me começar por cumprimentar, obviamente, a direção da APREN e o Pedro Amaral Jorge pelo excelente trabalho que faz sempre, não só na organização deste evento, mas também, obviamente, dia a dia na defesa deste paradigma que é o das energias renováveis, que se alinha firmemente com aquelas que são as prioridades estratégicas do país. Cumprimentar também, naturalmente, os associados da APREN, as minhas senhoras e meus senhores que aqui estão hoje. É, de facto, com grande satisfação que participo nesta conferência anual da APREN, Portugal Renewable Energy Summit, um evento que é, de facto, uma referência dedicado ao setor das energias renováveis. Agradeço à organização o convite e a oportunidade de partilhar convosco a visão estratégica do Governo sobre o sistema energético nacional, o papel que as renováveis desempenham e aquela que é a nossa visão para alcançarmos uma energia mais segura, competitiva e sustentável. Porque vivemos, de facto, um período decisivo e entusiasmante para a energia. A transição energética já não é uma ambição, é hoje uma realidade. E sabemos que Portugal tem de garantir energia segura, competitiva e sustentável. Esta frase repetida é hoje, de facto, de senso comum, mas constitui uma realidade que não deve ser tomada como garantida e que exige de nós um compromisso contínuo e uma ação coordenada, determinada e informada. E precisamente por dever ser informada, deve também ser continuamente testada e desafiada. E por isso hoje gostava de começar por partilhar convosco uma reflexão sobre 2 cenários do que o nosso sistema elétrico poderia ser. No primeiro cenário hipotético, o sistema elétrico assentaria em capacidade hídrica nacional, que já existe, complementada por algumas centrais de ciclo combinado a trabalhar continuamente. A energia fluiria de grandes infraestruturas para os consumidores, num percurso praticamente linear e relativamente simples. O segundo cenário será mais familiar para todos os presentes aqui hoje e incorpora fontes de energia renovável, como eólica, solar e outras formas de energia distribuída, num sistema mais descentralizado e dinâmico. E permitam-me explorar convosco uma análise destes 2 cenários em 5 dimensões. Uma perspectiva de complexidade operacional, carga administrativa, soberania e segurança de abastecimento, competitividade e sustentabilidade. Começando desde logo pela complexidade e carga administrativa, o cenário das renováveis apresenta maior complexidade. Mais pontos de produção, com diferentes dimensões e com maior diversidade de tecnologias e dimensão, o que representa maior volume de processos, maior necessidade de articulação entre entidades e um desafio maior a nível de gestão do território. Maior variabilidade, o que aumenta o nível de exigência de gestão da rede, consumidores que são também produtores e que querem consumir a energia que produzem, mas também rentabilizar os excedentes, veículos elétricos que colocam mais carga do lado do consumo, mas também com o potencial de funcionarem como baterias móveis. Toda esta complexidade exige redes mais inteligentes, maior capacidade de processamento e análise de dados, atuação em tempo real, armazenamento e gestão ativa da procura. E ainda nesta dimensão, o primeiro cenário é claramente mais simples, poucos produtores, despachabilidade garantida, uma gestão de rede com menos fluxo de dados e energia com menor dinamismo e um mercado com muito menor dinamismo. Mas esta simplicidade tem um preço e aqui entram as restantes dimensões de análise. O primeiro cenário, embora mais simples, exige recursos dos quais não dispomos, comprometendo assim a soberania nacional e limitando as nossas opções numa perspectiva de segurança de abastecimento. Estaríamos sujeitos a preços de energia mais elevados e expostos à volatilidade dos mercados internacionais. E poderia existir alguma forma de mercado, mas seria relativamente restrita e pouco dinâmica no seu funcionamento. E é também nestas dimensões que o cenário das renováveis mostra a sua verdadeira força. Através de fontes de energia renovável, somos mais independentes energeticamente, podemos aproveitar diferentes recursos complementares e disponíveis a nível nacional. Dispomos de um mercado dinâmico e com maior participação, permitindo-nos alcançar preços mais competitivos para as nossas empresas e para as nossas famílias. E garantimos a utilização de recursos sustentáveis que contribuem para a preservação do meio ambiente e para as futuras gerações. E deixa-me regressar à dimensão inicial para desmistificar a complexidade, que pode ser endereçada através de ferramentas tecnológicas e competências técnicas que assegurem níveis de resiliência e robustez do sistema adequados a um nível de mitigação de risco e eficiente a nível de custo. E também é importante não perdermos a perspectiva de que, embora existam desafios a nível de gestão do território, existem já estudos que indicam que uma parte significativa da área necessária à produção de energia renovável pode ser complementada com outros usos, nomeadamente urbanos ou industriais, sem comprometer o nosso ambiente e as nossas paisagens. Assim, desta análise, o cenário das renováveis sai reforçado como o cenário que permite endereçar de forma mais completa as necessidades do país em matéria de segurança, competitividade e sustentabilidade do nosso sistema. Concluo esta comparação de cenários com uma observação mais geral. Embora simplificada, esta análise demonstra a importância de mantermos uma postura de neutralidade perante tecnologias de produção em constante evolução. É neste contexto que iremos conduzir um estudo sobre custos totais de sistema associados a diferentes tecnologias e opções a longo prazo, porque só com base em factos e análise com fundamento técnico podemos continuar a tomar decisões de forma informada e que garantam a proteção do interesse nacional. Esta perspectiva analítica permite também evitar determinismos tecnológicos, ou seja, orientaremos a tomada de decisão sobre investimentos e compromissos de longo prazo com novas tecnologias, cujo estágio de evolução resulta em preços acima do preço de mercado. O nosso objetivo é garantir um sistema energético sustentável, soberano e competitivo. Não estamos iludidos com modas tecnológicas. Só investiremos quando fizer sentido para o sistema e para a nossa indústria verde. Olhando agora para o presente e para um futuro a mais curto prazo, aproveito também para destacar o caminho que estamos a percorrer para a concretização dos objetivos do PNEC, nomeadamente a nível de produção de energia renovável. Segundo dados da DGEG, em agosto de 2025, tínhamos já 12,2 gigawatts de potência instalada, associada à produção fotovoltaica e eólica. Sabemos também que todos os TRC atualmente atribuídos somam 23 gigawatts de potência adicional. Isto significa que se todos os TRC atualmente atribuídos forem concretizados até 2030, conseguiremos alcançar o objetivo do PNEC. É agora necessário assegurar que estes títulos se convertem em capacidade instalada ao ritmo necessário e, para isso, estamos a adotar medidas em 3 grandes áreas. O PNEC não é para nós uma receita única nem determinística. O que conta não é cumprir a lista específica de tecnologias, mas é sim cumprir os objetivos de renováveis e descarbonização. A nível de transparência de dados e de informação, iremos reforçar, através de um despacho, as obrigações de reporte da DGEG e dos operadores de rede relativamente ao ponto de situação destes projetos. Podemos já adiantar que existem pelo menos 3 gigawatts de potência que têm um prazo de entrada em exploração até ao final do próximo ano e está a ser realizado um levantamento do histórico que nos permitirá, em breve, comunicar dados mais precisos e com detalhe trimestral e por tecnologia. Tendo maior conhecimento do estado do avanço dos projetos e dos prazos que devem cumprir, queremos assegurar que existe um compromisso e previsibilidade com os mesmos. Por um lado, realizamos uma última prorrogação de prazos que fica claramente aplicável a todos os regimes de ligação através de um novo despacho. Reconhecemos uma conjugação de fatores que justificam o alargamento destes prazos, mas deixamos também claro que não serão realizadas novas prorrogações, dado que pretendemos simultaneamente dar maior previsibilidade e regularidade à colocação de nova capacidade em mercado. De forma mais imediata, está já prevista a realização do procedimento concorrencial para a atribuição da capacidade sobrante do pego até ao final deste ano, e novos procedimentos seguirão no ano que vem. Finalmente, estamos a desenvolver mecanismos que serão anunciados em breve para permitir agilizar a concretização dos projetos em desenvolvimento e alternativas para viabilizar a capacidade remanescente. Uma energia mais segura, competitiva e sustentável alcança-se também através de investimentos com previsibilidade e de projetos que saem do papel dentro do horizonte das nossas metas. Portugal mantém o compromisso com a transição energética e com a energia renovável, sempre considerando uma análise crítica e baseada em dados, acompanhando as evoluções tecnológicas e os respectivos preços e promovendo a colaboração entre promotores, operadores de rede e a todas as entidades na concretização da nova produção que contribua para uma energia mais segura, mais competitiva e mais sustentável. Estamos alinhados com a agenda europeia, mas queremos ir mais longe, usar as renováveis como fator de soberania e de reindustrialização. Não vamos pagar energia cara para exportar hidrogênio barato. O hidrogênio verde que produziremos deve servir, antes de mais, a indústria portuguesa. Este é o nosso compromisso. Transformar o potencial renovável de Portugal numa vantagem competitiva para as empresas, numa garantia de segurança para as famílias e num motor de sustentabilidade para o futuro. Este Portugal Renewable Energy Summit é uma plataforma privilegiada para contribuir para um diálogo sustentado e colaborativo. e para reforçarmos também a nossa ambição e o nosso compromisso com o futuro. Desejo a todos, por isso, um excelente trabalho e excelentes discussões. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado ao Sr. Secretário de Estado pela sua intervenção. Passamos agora ao primeiro painel do dia, a evolução global das renováveis e respectivas tendências, que contará com o discurso inicial do nosso convidado, também ele especial, Michael Liebrecht. Mr. Liebrecht, if you can join me on stage, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Minister, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I will try to follow that, which will be hard. It's great to be here in one of the unequivocal success stories of the transition. Unequivocal success stories. So that is down to all of you, and we'll come back to that during the course of my remarks. But what I want to do is maybe take a step back to, there's a lot going on the global stage. There's a lot of cross currents where some people say the transition is failing and it's ridiculous and we should stop, and some people say no, we must press on, and some people say, like myself, that we must press on but also change course where required. And I'm going to do it by dividing up this decade into two halves. And the first half, up until 2025, late 2024, let's call it, I call it the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. We came out of COVID. There was enormous growth in demand for clean energy, clean cars. Then, of course, there was the Russian invasion, illegal invasion of Ukraine, and what it did to gas prices. And so, if you look there at the investment, you know, I made my whole career around counting billions. Counting billions is fun. I should be a billionaire. But counting billions starting in 2004, and that was the growth. And then the Great Clean Energy Acceleration, which characterized the first years of this decade. And there it is in technologies. We went from marginal, no solar, no wind, almost no wind back in 2004. I've been on this journey with you, with so many of you, to the point where 90% of all the capacity being added worldwide is wind and solar. And if you look at what it's doing to the mix of electricity, that green line there is the non-hydro renewables. You're very lucky here. You've got some hydro, which is good. The hydro there is in blue. The green is mainly wind and solar. And that is the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. This is what economists call a substitution curve. Let's be in no doubt. It is a substitution curve. It is not an adding a little bit of clean energy. It's a substitution curve. And it's not just renewables. We're here in a renewables crowd. But you have allies. Electrification is your ally, your big ally. And here you've got electric vehicles, new sources of demand, and a source of demand that provides flexibility, smart charging, maybe vehicle to grid, but at the very least smart charging is your ally, because if there is an hour, a few hours, maybe even a day where there's low renewable resource, it's very helpful to have all these batteries. We're adding batteries to the grid. Many of you will be adding batteries to the grid, but most of the batteries will be in vehicles, cars, buses, trucks, and so on. And again, we've seen this huge acceleration. So your allies in electrification are doing well. We would like to see them do better, particularly in heating. Electrification of heating would help a lot. But the cars one do not underestimate and do not allow people to say, oh, people don't really want to buy them. There's been a slowdown. There hasn't been a slowdown. There's been some toing and froing with policy. But look at this. This is one of my favorite charts. It's dead simple. That is the 2011 Nissan Leaf. 15 years ago, the Nissan Leaf, launched by my friend Andy Palmer when he was at Nissan. And now, look at how that spec has changed. Just look at that. Twice the power, 3 times the battery, 3 times the speed of charging, and 4 times the range, for 2/3 of the real price. Hang on, I just realized why it's crackling. One second, let me deal with this. No, I think I'm good. One second. There we go. I apologize for that. Right. No, it's good. It's good. We're done. Oh, we weren't quite done. There we go. Oh, now we're done. Very good. Very good. So, but here's the question. This is impressive, but the real question, if you want to know what the future of transportation, your ally industry, looks like, think about that. Another 15 years. And if you see those trends continue even half as strong for the next 15 years, who is going to buy an internal combustion vehicle? Now, you go over to China and they get it. And they got it 15 years ago and aligned all of their policy accordingly. And what you see there is China, 1 in 2 cars, it's 1 in 4 in Europe, 1 in 2 is electric. And they are electrifying at a fearsome rate. They also understand that electrification is not just about the climate, it's also the way they're going to reduce dependence on imported fossil fuels without burning coal, 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 and more coal. And what do we see? China's emissions for the last year and a half, in a period of economic growth, not because of a crisis, have started, well, they look like they have peaked and maybe started to decline. And they announced during Climate Week that they were going to actually reduce emissions by 2035. Not by a lot, but the peak is almost certainly now over. It's not just about China and Europe. This trend is now going absolutely global, absolutely global. And this is Pakistan, where in 1 year, they imported enough solar to add 50% to the capacity of their grid. The agriculture sector in Pakistan now buys half of the electricity from the grid that it used to 2 years ago. And the difference is distributed solar. And Africa is coming as well. Data from the think tank Ember shows every country in Africa now importing and building solar, leapfrogging the model of energy that we built in Europe and the US and other developed countries. So what we see now, non-OECD, the global south, not China, look at what has happened to the energy mix. It happened later than here, but it is roaring ahead. And by the way, of course, China is behind that. It's exporting. We know that, and that can be very threatening to those people here who are on the supply chain side, particularly. That is worrying. And it's not easy. You know better than anybody else, because you lived through the biggest shock to this trend, which was April 28th. And I'm sure there'll be sessions today, and you'll be understanding why it happened, how it happened, and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. Even though it was not a renewables problem, It was a rate of change problem and a failure of a number of players problem. And we have to understand it and correct it. But we are in, as I said, one of the great success stories of this transition. One of the great success stories. There is the share of renewables in Europe. And there's Portugal, Iberia. There's the electricity price. And there's yours. And I can tell you, coming from the UK, that delta, that electricity price, the low electricity price, that is the key to continuing the momentum. In my country, my party today has announced that they want to repeal the Climate Change Act, historic legislation, the first in the world that actually locked in first an 80% reduction and then net zero, and they want to repeal it. Why? Because energy market design allowed the prices not to do that, but to become the highest in the G20. Whatever you do, do not risk those low prices. It may feel good to be paid more, but be very careful. It is a poison chalice. It is a Pyrrhic victory if you are extracting too much rent. That's a warning. But of course, behind all of this, there is somebody who feels extremely unhappy with it, extremely threatened by it. So at the time when I was over in Climate Week and the Chinese were announcing a 7 to 10% cut in emissions by 2035, a few blocks away from where I was the president saying that climate change is a contract. With this audience, I am not going to rehearse any science to debunk this. It doesn't need debunking in this audience. But the question is it the end of the transition? Is the US so powerful that they can bend the arc of history away from the transition? And it has to be said, if you consider the transition as 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees, anybody who doesn't buy into 1.5 degrees is a bad person. Is undermining, is not looking after the planet and the children, etc., etc. If that's your model, then you have to say the transition has failed. Because each time we don't cut fossil fuels by whatever percent by 2030, the next year we have to cut it even faster. And that model has failed. Now, we can go into the history of where 1.5 degrees came from and the Paris Agreement, which is actually about 2 degrees, and how economically catastrophic it would always have been had we tried to follow that pathway. But that is not the only transition. The transition is not 1.5 degrees or we give up. We're not going to hit 1.5 degrees. Are we ready to give up? Are you giving up? I'm not giving up. Now, it's not just the president in the US, there are these narratives that are being spread around, particularly in countries and in sectors of the economy that are very fossil dependent, about how it's all been a foolish attempt. All of the transition, not just the 1.5 degrees, the whole thing is foolish. And very often it hinges on this idea of primary energy, the amount of fossils that the economy needs. That the economy needs this fossil fuel, and it was 85%, and now it's 80%, and therefore anybody working on anything that is not fossil is misguided, foolish, childish. And I want to show you why that's wrong. We've all seen this, right? Global primary energy demand, what the economy needs. It needs. That is not what the economy needs. The economy doesn't need to shovel coal in the front end. What it needs is energy services. Over on that side, I love putting in ambient heat. It's completely missing from this, by the way, heat pumps, the impact of heat pumps. But that is the problem with primary energy. The moment somebody says primary energy, you know they are selling you a dud. Because what they're trying to sell you is waste. It really matters. If you go from a coal-fired filament light bulb to a solar-powered or wind-powered LED, you are cutting primary energy by 95%. The economy needs lighting. It doesn't need coal. Same with that Nissan Leaf, that electric car, or the BMW, or whatever, any car, BYD, Tesla. 75% reduction in primary energy just by going from an internal combustion car, same number of kilometers driven, same services, 75% reduction. Heat pumps, go from a gas boiler or a gas furnace to a heat pump, 75% reduction in primary energy. This is the stuff that real leaders help people understand and help people to execute and help people to power this with renewable energy, with clean energy. Now, yes, but what about data centers? The other thing going on in the US is they've gone crazy about AI, crazy about data, and the only way to power them is, of course, gas, we're told. Why? Why isn't the solution what every utility has found? That 90% of what they build is renewables. Why? Because you take renewables, you take batteries, you have a little bit of gas backup, you're done. And you're done more quickly and more cheaply. They will learn this. It will take them some time. And they will learn this. Even Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg, they will get a crash course in energy systems design from people like us. They will figure it out in the end. And data center demand, by the way, although it sounds huge in percentage terms, in absolute terms, actually it's not that substantial. It is difficult demand to meet, don't get me wrong. It is gigawatts in a very concentrated location. And it's being bought by the richest companies in the world. They're very demanding, so they want big chunks of power in specific locations. But they are not the only sources of additional demand. And demand is good. People make out, we can't cope because demand is growing and this is terrible. No, demand is good. Why? In my country, in the UK, 50% of the bill is the fixed cost. Not the generation, but the fixed cost of the grid and all the ancillary services. More demand is a bigger denominator. You divide that cost of all the fixed costs by a larger number. It's fabulous. More demand, not only is it flexible, that it gives you demand response, heat pumps and cars with batteries, it's fabulous, it's your ally, but also more demand is a bigger number to amortize the cost of the fixed assets across. It's a fantastic, virtuous circle that can be unleashed. More demand, lower electricity cost. Lower electricity cost, more demand. Now, those very rich companies have decided that they want to do gas, but what they really want to do is nuclear, is SMRs. Everybody's going crazy about SMRs. I just want to show you this. And I hope they pay the money for it because they can afford it. And I hope they build a few. Because then we'll all learn what they cost and how long it takes to build them and how you develop a supply chain. We need to know that. But as a climate solution, single chart to explain why SMRs are not a relevant climate solution. If you wanted to build, there's across the horizontal axis the size of an SMR. There's some very little ones and some bigger ones. And if you wanted your SMRs to generate as much electricity as you're getting from renewables globally, these are the numbers. 2,000 of the 300 megawatt plants, 2,000 of them. The big ones, Rolls-Royce, 1,250, the small ones even more. That's just to catch up with where wind and solar are today. Now we may get 3, 5 by 2030. We may get a few hundred by 2040. Are you going to get thousands? And what do you think you will have built in the interim? Where will wind and solar be by 2050? And the SMRs, they're struggling to reach the first 1,000 or 2,000 units, maybe, if they're lucky. This is the reality, cold hard numbers, which a lot of people out there, not in this room, don't want to hear. There we go. If I was the president of the US, I would say this is it's clearly a conspiracy. It's clearly a conspiracy. They're trying to shut me up. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by saying, okay, so the 1.5 degree, talking about ever more dramatic cuts in fossil fuels, every year that it doesn't happen, we become even more forceful about the need to cut even more quickly. That has failed. What is going to work? So the first thing is, when you adjust for the primary energy fallacy, what you actually discover is that over 30% of the energy services, the lighting, the heat, the cold beer, the power for the MRIs, over 30% is already clean today. Not 20%, over 30%. We're a third of the way through this. And now I just built this very, very simple model, trivially simple model. 4 lines. The economy grows, a bit of energy efficiency, so energy demand grows, but not at 3.5%, it grows at 2%. And then clean energy, which is the blue bit, renewables, and the red bit, nuclear, it just grows faster than energy demand. But it does it every year, decade after decade. So if the economy grows at 3 and a bit, demand grows at 2, clean energy grows at 5, then what happens? The next 10 years, not much. Clean energy from a smaller start, the 5% growth is barely enough to absorb new energy demand. 10 more years. This is what happens when you subtract a geometrically growing chunk from a slower growing. So it's adding or subtracting geometric growth. 10 more years. And you can see the geometric growth in clean energy really starting to bite, and by 2065, fossil has been forced off the system. This is not a forecast. This is an illustration of what happens when people like you keep working year in, year out. You show leadership, you bring on talent, you recruit the next generation, they keep working year in and year out, and we solve the biggest problem on the planet today. We don't do it by talking about cutting 50% of emissions in 5 years or in 15 years or whatever. We do it by building clean energy. That's how we do it. So, the transition like a hare, the sprint for the finish line, we would all love to see it. It has failed. But the transition like a tortoise, build clean. Just keep the growth in clean faster than the growth in energy demand. That will achieve the transition. And just in terms of the practicalities, the sorts of things that means is, if you look at the cost of decarbonizing the grid, it goes very steep when you get to very high numbers. Well, you can get 85, 90% of the way there at low cost. And that saves you resources to do, did I say, electrification is your great ally. So you don't push for 100%. You push for the 85 or 90% fast at by whatever affordable, quick means you can, and that will enable the costs that we talked about. I said that keeping the costs down is the most important thing. That enables you to keep the costs down, and it keeps the public on board, and we've seen how vital that is. And so, the next 5 years, if the first 5 years was the great clean energy acceleration, the next 5 years is going to be the pragmatic climate reset, focusing on continuing to build without pushing up the costs of electricity, particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leverreich. Vou convidar agora o Pedro Amaral Jorge, o Bruce Douglas e o Ben Backwell a juntarem-se aqui comigo em palco.
By the way, Michael, the mic was not a sabotage issue. It was an incident. So let's do this in a funny way. We keep Michael on the spot. Ben and Bruce, you sit over there. No, you please sit here. You are the guy on the hot spot for the things we want to discuss. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Great job. I think we can actually send this to some natural gas and oil associations to check that there's no chance they can actually win this. But anyhow, so coming out from what we discussed and what you presented, I have a couple of questions that I would like to go with it, with the three of you. And I'm going to jump around. And of course, by the end, if someone will have any points they would like to address, we have Slido. Just please include the questions and we'll try to take them as soon as possible. You mentioned that, but I would like to hear it in like 3 minutes. How do renewables drive socioeconomic development worldwide, depending on the levels of economic development of each region?
So I think I opened up the answer to that in my remarks by showing how this is starting to really spread around the world. And 5 years ago, you could still say, certainly 10 years ago, people were saying all the time, you know, this is just a rich country game. This is a rich, we're being self-indulgent by doing these expensive things, wind and solar. You know, when I started this, a solar was something you put onto a parking meter, you put onto a pocket calculator. And people put it on a house, they were mad. But of course, you know, so up to about 10 years ago, you could still say this is so expensive. Now, it's not just a bunch of people in a conference saying, actually, it's cheap. It's farmers in Pakistan, you know, and it's around the world. And it's clearly driving economic growth. I mean, the farmers are doing it because they are making more money from farming by doing it. So it is an enormous driver. Of course, within the industry, we like to talk about the jobs, clean jobs, green jobs, and so on. I'm always nervous about that. Politically, I say my party is centre-right. Well, it used to be centre-right. But green jobs, a job is also a cost. So if you want really, really cheap green power, it's green power that doesn't create lots of jobs. It's actually green power that is very efficiently produced and installed probably by robots and so on. So we've got to be very careful about the green jobs argument. It does create employment, and but not to overtrade that argument. But I think that affordable, clean energy that then doesn't put all of the externality costs onto, for instance, the health system through air pollution and so on, is of course a vast economic driver. Vast.
Thank you, Michael. That was one of the points I wanted to check. Bruce. The climate change narrative alone failed to impulse renewables deployment. We cannot only do it by climate change. What are the positive externalities of renewables, and what should the narrative be now?
Thank you, Pedro. And thank you so much for inviting me to this event and to Lisbon. I love Portugal, not just for the climate and the food, but for what you said at the beginning, Michael, about I think it's north of 70% penetration of renewables.
80 last year.
80%.
On generation.
I mean, as I travel around the world meeting policymakers, I point to Portugal as a success story, an industrialized country that has transitioned. is well on the way to transitioning. And I mean, that's to your question, which is, what are the benefits of renewables that we can point to beyond clean and climate? And there's extensive benefits. I was in New York last week with Michael, and in advance of Donald Trump's intervention, we placed this advert in the New York Times to just highlight three of the, you mentioned jobs, I'll come back to you on that, three of the benefits: jobs, security, and growth. So renewable energy is better than fossil fuels across all these. But also when I showed this, people said, what about affordability? Good. What about clean air? Good. The list is long. So on jobs, currently, renewables globally employ 16 million people. It is a cost, but to employ those in fossils would also be a cost. In fact, per dollar invested, renewables employ 3 times more people than fossil fuels. That's going to increase to 38 million by 2030. On security, last year, as Michael showed, 90% of all power additions were renewable. Of those projects, 90% of them are now generating power cheaper than new fossil fuel alternatives. So it's avoiding volatile fossil fuel costs. And to put a number on it, last year, those projects saved $460 billion in 1 year and will do every year while those projects exist. And finally, growth. Clean energy added 10% GDP globally last year alone. And on jobs, I mean, I see your point, but cost, has to be compared to fossil fuel job cost. And in the markets we work in, emerging markets and developing economies, job creation, employment, good quality jobs are what renewables deliver. And I think that is something that policymakers can understand. They ask us, what's in it for me? Why should we develop renewables? Well, those are some of the arguments we use. And my experience in New York last week was extremely positive. Almost exclusively, people were saying, yeah, we're all in. How do we do it? Not why do we do it, how do we do it? Tell us how we can transition. And Portugal is a great example of exactly how to do it. Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Ben, which regions are truly leading the renewable race, and comparing Europe, China, and the US, other emerging markets? In your analysis, what you do daily, what explains their success, and what advantages can Europe take from the US administration on the views of energy?
Morning, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Pedro, for the invite. Fascinating to hear you, Michael, this morning in your presentation. It was very crisp. And good morning to all of you here. It's great to be back in Lisbon again. Who's winning in the transition at the moment? Undoubtedly, China is going faster than anyone else. And it's interesting in China because we're now in China competing directly against unregulated coal generation and winning. And I remember being there 2-3 years ago when we still had some price regulation in that competition. We were quite worried. My industry, the wind industry, was quite worried about what would happen when they completely took away the regulated aspect. And actually, it's fine. We're winning. And it's interesting. Wind is winning in China to the extent that probably next year we replace hydro as the second biggest source of generation in China. This year, we will probably do 100 gigawatts in China alone, 100 gigawatts this year for the first time. We seem to be on course for that. But there's plenty of other places. And I mean, it's always been a kind of US, Europe, China, and that's now becoming much more diversified, as Michael has pointed to. So, for instance, within Europe, it's quite a differentiated picture, but Germany is going through a massive acceleration. And a lot of that is to do with political changes, clear direction of travel, reform of permitting and planning, and Germany is doing really well. The UK, although, as Michael's alluded to, the politics are difficult, they're implementing, and there's record amounts of projects being permitted every quarter, and there's a huge build-out that actually is probably not being talked about enough because of the kind of difficulty of the politics, but it's happening. And then, if you look at what's happened in investment, it's really, really interesting. In the first half, investment in renewables in the US declined by something like 36% compared to the similar period the year before. So that's 36% down in the US. So a drop of about 25 billion in investment in clean energy in the US in the first half. And then in Europe, it's gone up actually by about 30 billion. So there's actually, and as BNEF says, there seems to be a clear transfer of investment coming from the US into Europe, which is really, really interesting. And I mean, what would you expect? I mean, you get a situation where you artificially slow down deployment, you don't let the cheapest sources come onto the market, that's going to push the investment elsewhere. I personally am convinced that, eventually the US will retake the path of clean energy, just because the economics demand it, and the power demand is there, and it's a huge opportunity for the US. We are seeing a hiatus, and we're seeing a chilling effect on investment because of basically insecurity of the investment panorama. Right? It's become a risky place. We hope that in the long term, the midterm, that will come back. And then finally, I mean, there's lots of other places which are now becoming serious players. And I'd mentioned South Korea is one of them, a place where we've been working a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. New energy targets this morning, a new 100 gigawatt target. And then we've got a whole number of very significant developing countries coming into the market, Vietnam, the Philippines, which is holding its first offshore wind tender later this year, and so on and so on. And India, again, about to bust through a new record again, and actually going a long way in terms of its reforms and speeding things up. So there's a whole new number of actually very significant countries with very fast-growing power demand, very fast-growing industrial demand, which are about to join the party in a very significant way. And it's about staying the course, and it's about finding the right places to invest in, and it's about investing where we can get the right signals and the right long-term predictability. But we will win if we stay the course, and I very much agree with Michael's message in that. We need to keep plugging away and building.
Thank you. I'm going to take on that one about the bankability. So it is still the preferred tool to actually develop projects going through project finance because of the leverage it allows you. And basically the point that we are seeing here, and depending on the behavior of the wholesale market on the day and intraday regarding zero prices, to complement this, do you think that carbon markets, green bonds, PPAs and CFDs are enough to renewable market de-risk investment globally, or do we need another set of financial instruments and the financial market needs to adapt to new solutions?
So that is a huge question, because I think
only have 3 minutes,
I think because it's very. If you look at how to get this stuff built, so set aside the US, which is doing its own thing, but the rest of the world divided into essentially countries with high penetration and lower penetration. China, although it's so huge in what it's doing, it's still actually got relatively low penetration, right? Because the population is so big. When you start down the track of doing renewables, you've got so much flexibility in the system. You've got a grid, you've got some gas, and so you're not really coming up against constraints. And you can build, and the levelized cost is about the cost that people experience, and it's all. So in that environment, a CFD or a contract, anything that gives you bankability is absolutely sufficient. When you get to the deeper penetration markets, we're actually up against challenges, because then for every dollar that you put into, or every euro that you put into renewables, you may need to attract another euro into the grid. And so then you get the much bigger challenges, and much more nuance is needed. So I would say anything that gives bankability for the low penetration markets, could be a PPA, could be a CFD, could be whatever. In the ones where the markets are, I don't want to say saturating, because I don't think they are saturating, they just become more complex. We've got to be more nuanced. So the classic, contract for difference, it encourages build at all costs, is kind of a blunt instrument. It doesn't mind where it's built, whether that power is very useful or not, and so on. And there we need to start being much more nuanced around whether it's capacity markets or whether it's other mechanisms to put it together. The carbon markets, Europe is essentially the only place that has really got a meaningful carbon price. And, we saw in Canada, even though the money was being collected and then distributed to people, they still objected to it politically. So I think, it's just too glib to say that we need a carbon price. I think what we need is a nuanced set of policies that enable bankability, but aligning the incentives so that we can keep the prices down. So not over subsidizing and driving up, and hitting people with costs that are excessive. So short version, it's complicated.
It is, and one of the things that we are seeing, for example, in Iberia, is that some of the PV projects are being a little delayed because you look at the market and you have tremendous amount of our prices until battery storage is there to do either energy shifting or you load consumption to other hours of the day.
Can I tell you a story? I went to Chile, and they have 3,000 hours, this was last summer, 3,000 hours a year with zero marginal prices on every node of their beautiful, zonal priced, which is another thing we need to talk about, zonal pricing. Or
if we have time, we'll go there in the end.
But they have zero cost, and they said, Mr. Liebreich, for 20 years you've been saying this stuff is cheap and it's all going to happen and et cetera, and look, how are we supposed to build anything with a zero marginal price? And I said, are there people that in those regions driving vehicles? And they said, yeah. And I said, are all those vehicles electric? And they said, well, no. Most Chileans are still driving big SUVs, or the wealthier ones, internal combustion. I said, well, so why are you asking me what to do? Right? You have to do the renewable development hand in hand with the demand growth.
Of course.
Right? Flexible demand growth. It's your ally, one of my big messages.
Thank you on that topic, so I'm going to pick up on that, excuse me, and go back to Bruce. Is renewable energy incorporation on power generation decreasing or increasing? And if it's increasing, is it at the right pace? And what do we need to do to increase its deployment speed? Since we have a vision from Michael today that 100% by 2050 might be difficult. He has a new vision, so what is your vision?
First of all, Pedro, I'm going to take this opportunity for a commercial break.
Go ahead. We'll allow you that 2 minutes.
I can't miss this opportunity. I mean, such a crowd you've gathered here, Pedro. So June this year, we organised with the Global Wind Energy Council and EPREN the Lisbon Future Dialogue as part of the Lisbon Future Fest. We're going to organise the same again next year in May. Date to be confirmed, but we'll make sure you're all informed, and with the great collaboration of Pedro and Ben and Michael, you'll be there as well, I'm sure. Advert over. The good news is that renewables are breaking records every year. Ben pointed to the investment figures. They're up globally. The bad news is, first of all, it's not fast enough. We are way off tripling and way off the 1.5 degrees. Actually, I do agree with you on that pragmatic climate reset, Michael. Very well put and structured argument. But the figures for renewables need to triple by 2030 to get close to what you're describing. That's about 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. It's about 300 gigawatts a day every day between now and 2030. If you know what a gigawatt looks like, you can imagine the challenge. But we are heading towards about 2.5 degrees. So that, for us, is a missed opportunity. And Ben pointed to many of the levers, and Michael as well, that you can pull: grid connection, queue reform, permitting acceleration, and so on, that just accelerate those things. The second thing is it's not happening where it really should. And so it's not an equitable spread. And Michael, you said, oh, it's not just happening in the rich countries. You're right, it's starting to develop in those emerging markets. But the figures are that 80% of the investment went to EU, China, and US. So 20% to those all other markets, 4% went to Africa. So in those markets where they really need power, I mean, in the West, in Portugal, you don't need additional power. It's not happening. And the reason is risk. So the return on investment is too low, the cost of capital is too high, sometimes 2, 3, or 4 times higher than in developed markets. Risk perception is too high. So if you look at the real default rates of some of those emerging markets, it's actually lower than some of the developed countries. So what we're pushing for is a de-risking of those investments in those emerging markets so that private capital can pour in. Historically, over the last 10 years, 75% of investment in renewables came from the private sector. But you need the conditions. You need clarity, long-term stability, investor confidence, and that lower cost of capital. Public money can be invested strategically to unlock private capital. That's what we're advocating for.
Thank you, Bruce. You want to jump in?
Yeah, if you want to, if you would like me
I'm more
to,
than happy
because
you
I want to
do.
build on that. Because I was one of the things I did during Climate Week is I was at an event hosted by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, so that was CIP, on the fast-growing emerging markets. And this business about the perception of risk is absolutely key. Set Africa or lots of African countries aside, but there was a lot of the people that are now allocating assets within pension funds, within insurance companies, they started their career and one of the first things that happened was the sovereign debt crisis, 1998. And so they're very worried about sovereign risk. These countries are totally different now. Mexico, India, South Africa, Brazil, just so many, and loads of countries in Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the sophistication of their own capital markets, the sophistication of their own economies, the levels of capital formation that have happened. It's completely a different world, and I'm afraid it's a bunch of asset allocators, public and private asset allocators, who simply haven't caught up. They simply haven't kept up with that. And that has to change, because as soon as your pension fund, instead of saying, oh, we'll put 2% into growth markets, as soon as they look around and go, well, hang on a second, look at the countries we're talking about, that should be 15%, that is going to just pour money into this sector.
Yeah, and credit credit rating agencies, anybody working in credit agencies, I mean, look seriously at what you're doing. I don't know if anybody works in emerging markets, but they have a huge role to play in de-risking.
And what they've been saying, of course, is that the US is safe as houses.
Yeah.
Right? And then you look at what's happened to Empire Wind and Revolution, and you look what's happened with the subsidies being yoinked with no notice, the federal tax credits and so on. And suddenly the market that you've grown up saying, well, that's safe as houses, looks much, much riskier. And meanwhile, if they don't understand this, they need to get on a plane, I hate to say it for the climate, get on a plane and go and visit some of the markets that they've been starving of capital.
Yeah. This is actually emerging as a very big theme ahead of COP. And in fact, we've been working quite closely with the Brazilian BNDES, the National Economic Social Development Bank, around this question, because it's a real bee in our bonnet. We haven't seen a lot of our projects fall down in Latin America or in Africa. Actually, the big crises have been the Spanish crisis, now the US doing the things that Michael's describing, but we don't see projects defaulting, in Brazil and other places like that. And yet the perception of risk is completely out of proportion. And that is something I think we need to work at also on a macro level, at COP and with MDBs. And
I'm going to jump on the debate as not a moderator. I lived 6 years in Brazil and I spent almost 10 years in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I can tell you for sure that if you do with multilateral financing, with the states, with the sovereign guarantees, with MIGA and with all of that, you can actually get a stronger and more robust financial structure for a project than in Europe or the US. But it's very difficult to explain that in this panel, so we leave it. We do a session on that one day from now. But I have a question for you, because one thing that keeps saying, especially the fossil industry, is that the energy transition is being designated and implemented so that households, workers, corporates, industries, and mature and emerging economies see it more as difficult than fair and beneficial. So what do we need to communicate so that narratives will sustain this legitimacy of what we are doing and we actually show what's happening and not being bombed by disinformation? How do we actually fight it in this fossil and nuclear industry lobby?
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. I mean, I think there's two aspects to this. I mean, the first aspect is in the real world, and that's to do with challenges which I describe as challenges of the mid-transition. So are there real challenges? Yes, there are, right? And we just saw what happened in Spain and Portugal in April. We've seen curtailment in many places, even places like Brazil that are going fast. There's huge curtailment at the moment and so on. So, are there challenges with the transition? Yes, of course there are, right? And does that cause price rise in some places? Does it cause curtailment in other places? Does it cause negative power prices in other places? All those things are real, but they're all things that you can work through. And typically, I mean, I remember 10 years ago, regulators and system operators saying, that 20% penetration of renewables was too high and too risky. And now many places are at 40, 50%, and it's working, right? So some of those things are real things, and we need to just steadily work through the challenges, build grid, build market systems, and tweak them so that they work properly, right? So those are the real things. And those things, we need to work on together with government, with communities, with regulators, and so on. The second aspect is how we communicate the transition. And there, I think we have a big and growing problem. It's a really increasing problem, and it's to do with a couple of things. I think it's to do with a change in the kind of social pressure. If you go back to Glasgow and the COP in Glasgow, there was huge marches for climate. There was Greta out there doing her thing. Even, I mean, I used to live in a village in the UK. We had climate strikes in my village, in the school. We live in the middle of nowhere. And we had our kids, my kids were at the secondary school doing climate strikes. There was that kind of social pressure before the pandemic. And I feel that during the pandemic, people became very, very demobilized. So that's the first trend. The second trend is that there was a massive spread of disinformation. And the ownership of the media platforms has also shifted. And the ideas of the people who own the media platforms has also shifted. So don't forget, I mean, 5 years ago, Facebook and X or Twitter were deplatforming Donald Trump. They were literally taking off Donald Trump and other people from their platforms. Now they're enthusiastically promoting them, and we're about to see TikTok being taken over. So if you look at all the real estate in terms of who owns the real estate and the eyeballs, we're in a different world. We are literally looking at platforms that are now becoming dominated by disinformation, false information, and it is confusing people. And let's not kid ourselves. Now, what do? I mean, we need to up our game. Right? And I mean, I'm very impressed in Portugal. I mean, it's a great measure by the great work that Pedro does in the media and informing and educating. In Portugal, there's still some sensible debate. In many places, you're hearing now at street level really ridiculous stuff. And Michael, alluded to the fact that the British Conservative Party now is about to try and rescind or oppose the Climate Act. Right? For many, many years, we had bipartisan support in the UK, where all the parties were showing up at offshore wind farms and onshore wind farms and new storage facilities and so on. And that political consensus, which underlies the climate plans, is in danger of kind of unraveling or fragmenting. And I think that's something that we, as an industry, we need to be paying a lot more attention about, both the kind of hard question of disinformation and how we combat it, but also how do we build political consensus, how do we have sensible messages, and how do we communicate a story around success? I think Bruce showed his advert from New York Climate Week. That advert really resonated. It's a message of success, of gains to be made, of positive outcomes to be had by people, and we need to tell that story a lot louder, I think.
I completely agree.
Can I give two practical examples of what, because I think just talking about success is not the same as delivering it. So one thing is we have to deliver those low prices. The difference between Portugal, you've done all of this and you've kept the prices down, and the UK, where we've done all of this and have the highest electricity prices in the world, right? And we've got to deliver. So we've got to actually deal with that. It's a practical problem in your first bucket, but it matters. The second thing is, in terms of what I would say is, in the media, in your second bucket, the media war, stop attacking fossil fuels. It just doesn't help. It doesn't persuade anybody. Build more and talk about your successes. And then obviously, get that message out. But as soon as it becomes a negative message about you're bad if you use a car, you're bad if you use a bit of fossil fuel, the problem with that is everybody knows they have to use those things to go about their daily life. And so you're demonizing people for going on holiday because they flew somewhere. And it's just, that is such a terrible message, and I think the time for that is over.
Let me push back on that. I mean, I agree we shouldn't attack consumers about it. We shouldn't say, don't do this, don't do that. Totally agree with that. But I think we should highlight the failure of fossil fuel.
I agree with you, not him.
You know, I think we need, I mean, maybe it's not the Global Renewables Alliance saying fossil fuels, you know, are expensive, you know, volatile, you know, but someone has to be out there saying that. They're saying it about us. I mean, you know, Donald Trump's speech was a clear example.
That's the point.
You know,
his speech about wind.
Yeah, it was about wind, about renewables. It's a scam. I don't know if anybody in this room believes it's a scam. Maybe put your hand up if you do. I'm sure you wouldn't be here if you did. Was there a hand there? No.
If it is, it's by mistake. We don't allow people to get in if they think climate change is a scam.
But you see my point. I mean, they have no hesitation in brutally attacking us at the highest level across all media platforms. And I think maybe it's time for us to...
Do you want me to continue? Or if you
no, I want you to continue for 2 minutes.
No,
because we only have 15.
Okay. Yeah.
If we have time, we're going to go back to this, because I think this is going to be polemic as I expected. One of the other narratives that I'm going to tell a personal story. Every time I put a LinkedIn post with a, let's say, incisive message that maybe people are not telling the truth, they jump on me and say, well, I put the levelized cost of electricity of PV and wind and batteries. And so they come back to me and say, you're lying, because this is not about levelized cost of electricity. This is about levelized full system cost of electricity. And so you are deceiving consumers by saying that you are cheaper when actually you are not. So basically, Michael, what is true and what is false, and what is the role of storage on this, and how can we actually show that we are actually telling the truth? You explained earlier that as long as the penetration of renewables in an electrical system is low, it's all about levelized cost of electricity, and if it's higher, you need to include grids. But when you compare to the alternative, are we cheaper or are we not?
Great question. And you know, you're asking it of somebody who probably outside academia, you know, me and my team at what was first New Energy Finance and then Bloomberg New Energy Finance were among the people who took levelized cost, quite an academic concept, and started to say, look, you know, if it is, you know, wind is already low. Solar, of course, was very high. It was, you know, $300 or 300 euros per megawatt hour when I first calculated it. And then, of course, it was clearly coming down at a huge rate. And so we talked a lot about levelized cost. And the reason, I think it was innocent. For a certain period, you could claim it was innocent because every solar farm, every solar panel you connected, you could use all the power. There were no constraints. There was no oversupply. And so levelized cost, we didn't have discussions in the early days about, well, how many hours per year should we assume? It was very simple. It was however many hours it's sunny, however many hours it was windy, and that was the number you put in, and took off a bit for maintenance, and then that maintenance bit went down, right? And I think that later it became a little less innocent because you had to make assumptions, and you could still use levelized cost because you could say, well, given that it has a zero marginal cost, it's always going to be dispatched ahead of everything else. And so it's going to do its hours and to hell with everything else, right? So that you could still argue that. But of course...
But it's a valid argument on the model.
But it is a valid argument to push back on.
It's not lying, it's just saying...
So it's not... In no way is a levelized cost a lie. In no way. It is a metric. It is a metric. And by the way, it is the only metric at the level of a technology or a project that you can kind of agree a methodology on, because you mentioned levelized system cost or levelized firm cost, and there's been a number of attempts, and the IEA has tried to do this. And the problem with that is, as soon as you look at the cost of integrating renewables or the cost of adding storage to renewables, then you cannot do it at a project level. Because the amount of backup that you need is not about a project. The amount of backup that you need, the integration cost, is an emergent property of the system. You have a system that's got lots of hydro, it's a low number. You've got a system with no hydro, it's a high number. You can't just say, solar costs this. Go, Mr. Minister, don't do solar because there's this secret bit that you've got to add to every single project. That's utter nonsense.
I agree.
I don't know if I'd call it a lie, but it's nonsense.
I call it a lie.
It's a lie if you say it's the same for every project. Yes, it would qualify in my book as a lie. So we need to just be nuanced. We need to say that, what is, if we do wind, solar, what will be the impact on the system cost? We need to be honest. We need to be mature as an industry and say, you do have to invest in the grid, digitization, storage, expansion, but those costs are to the benefit of every technology. And one of the discussions, nuclear, right? The people say, wind and solar are variable and nuclear is baseload, and so wind and solar, each project has to put in storage, but the nuclear does. Excuse me, have you heard of jellyfish?
Yes.
Right? Because when there's a lot of jellyfish, all the nuclear shuts down along that section of the coast. And what do you think? Do you think that doesn't need backup? You think that doesn't need storage or spinning reserves or a connection over to a neighboring country that can help you in that period? And it's not just, it could be cracks in the nuclear power station, the pipework, it could be jellyfish, it could be a security nuclear needs backup too. So if they want to play the game of every solar power station requires 100% backup, then I'm afraid every nuclear power station needs 100% backup too. So let's play that game, right? And so it's nuanced, and we need to think of it at the system level and be very mature about how we as an industry, we don't just say, to hell with you, we're only going to talk levelized cost. We talk system cost, but we do it in a sophisticated way.
Yeah, let me hand over to Ben, and before that, the only thing that, the reason why I don't, talking about the oil industry and all of that, or trashing would be the word, the only reason that I think we need to be more aggressive is because at the end of the day, okay, you include wind and solar and batteries and it's very expensive, but never one explains what is the alternative and how much that alternative costs.
Correct.
And that's something that we are missing also in our communication. Go ahead, Ben.
I thought I was being fairly aggressive there with my little rant.
I'm just,
so I think I hope I did okay.
You were. You did great.
Maybe building on Michael's points a little bit from our point of view at GWEB, but also the Global Renewables Alliance, where I'm chair and work with Bruce. And I mean, one of the reasons we formed the GRA was because we realized we needed to be working much more closely together as technologies. Because of these reasons, we need to get more subtle and we need to get more nuanced in how we build and how we talk about regulation. It's interesting, I mean, in places where you just build solar, you're going to get more problems, right? Because you're looking at an LCOE and you're looking at capacity, you're looking at capacity installations, you're not looking at the picture. I mean, India now is moving to very sophisticated auctions where you combine wind and solar and battery, wind and battery and so on, right? And they're looking at round-the-clock power, and it's starting to work, right? And it's starting to work where developers don't look at what a single technology, they look at combinations of technology depending on the place, the resource, how it fits into the system, the capture price, the impact on transmission and all those kind of things. So we need to get better at doing that. It's complex, and quite often we see, for instance, the LCOE and then the capacity installations, and it doesn't mean that much. I mean, we've got, wind has got something like 4 times the capacity factor on average of solar, right? And actually wind in China, where you can build, is actually winning in the system, right? Because it's not just about the capacity installation. It's about the capacity factor and the location and the efficiency, right? So we need to get better at doing that so that we minimize the costs of our installation across our different technologies that are available in different places. We need to get policymakers to understand that it's not the same installing 5 gigawatts of solar as it is installing 5 gigawatts of wind if you've got 4 times the capacity factor, depending on where you are in the system and so on. But maybe just to go against Michael a little bit and some of his points, and we were having this discussion at dinner last night, I'm still very much in favour of the blunt instruments in many places, right? We need to create a pathway and a direction of travel that you can't go back on. And if you look at historically what's happened, I mean, China, we had huge curtailment problems 10 years ago because we were building in northwest of China, northern China. We were getting 30-40% curtailment at different times, right? That's now gone minimum. Why? Because the Chinese have invested massively in HVDC and hugely in transmission, smart transmission, and so on. So, but if they hadn't done that, they'd still be burning, nearly all coal. Right? If they hadn't made that massive investment in renewables, infrastructure, and grid. And the same thing in Brazil. I mean, we built in Bahia, and some of those wind farms, they were sitting there for 2 years. It was the best kept secret in Brazil, but they were sitting there for two years, and we were, kind of making them spin while we waited for the transmission to get there. And that's just the fact. But now they're there, and they're 28% of the Brazilian system, right? And if we hadn't done that, and we hadn't made that big investment in infrastructure, it wouldn't have happened.
Let me pick up on that point. So we understand that we need a massive amount of funding. Hopefully it should be private. So Bruce, how can we massively attract more private capital and debt to the renewable power generation? But not only then, do you think that if we attract this to the renewable part of the renewable generation parts, will it also press for grids and consumptions to also have that type of investment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of the topics have been covered. But I mean, first of all, there's a lot of private sector companies in the room. And what we say is profit is not a dirty word. We need sustainable companies making adequate profit to survive. And what we're seeing in an era when we should be accelerating and building ththese companies, we're seeing bankruptcies and layoffs. And so that goes back to the return on investment, the capital, the cost of capital, and so on. And there's about 10 things we could say to policymakers that list out what would attract private investment. A few of them are clarity, so clear, ambitious, technology-specific targets. Targets are not turbines, so you need to turn that into plans. Long-term energy plans, so stability, policy stability. You also need policy coherence across ministries. You need the energy ministry to be talking to the finance ministry, to be speaking to industry, etc. You need that across all government. Grids and storage is really key. Grids, let's not dive into it, but the business model of grids is more complicated. It needs public support. It needs to be very carefully thought out, but you need anticipatory investments. We as a renewables lobby, I lobby more for grids and storage than I do for renewables right now. Mm-hmm. Patrick's given me the thumbs up. Short and long duration, so batteries and pumped hydro and so on. You need to move this obscene amounts of green electrons that are now coming on, abundant green electrons, in time through storage and in location through grids to demand offtake. And electrification and demand increase, and I think we haven't said enough about electrify everything in brackets that can be electrified with renewable energy. That's my personal mission. That will drive demand, it'll lower costs and accelerate consumer interest. And finally, the level playing field. The huge elephant in the room is fossil fuel subsidies. Direct subsidies globally is 1.3 trillion. By coincidence, that's how much we need annually investment in renewables to meet the tripling goal.
So it's just shifting that.
It's shifting it, being very careful. Let's not, shift it onto fossil fuels. We know that in emerging markets, if you put the price of energy up, you get energy poverty, there's major socioeconomic problems. But there's a big question mark over what you do with taxation on electricity. Taxation on electricity is double what it is in gas in most European markets.
It should be shifted.
Immediately remove that taxation. Makes electricity more attractive, electrify, and makes renewables. And it clarifies the question. My mum phones me, says, Bruce, you said take on 100% renewable tariff. She did. And she calls me and says, well, now my power bill has gone up. I said, well, it's not renewables, it's the gas price which is setting the renewables. How do you explain that to my 85-year-old mother?
You don't.
You don't. But you need the governments to take action to reduce the electricity tariff so that the bill is matched with the lower renewable costs.
You want to jump in? Because I have two questions from the audience.
For your mum, you can also explain to your mum that the electricity price in the UK is set by gas 96% of the time, even though gas is only 26% of the supply. That is not a gas problem, that is a market design problem. That is because we don't have zonal pricing, we don't have locational pricing.
Let's not dive into that.
I mean, anywhere in the country that you need one gas-fired power station, your mum is going to pay the gas price, and we have to stop that.
Her reply to that would be, Bruce, do something about it. So
support zonal pricing. That would be what you could do about it.
We can do an event just for zonal pricing because that's going to take us very far. We have two questions from the audience and I would like to use them. The first one, how will you solve the baseload energy need in the grid? Can you ask this in 35 seconds?
Yeah, who asked the question? I want to see somebody who uses the word baseload. Who asked the question? Look, there is no base load need.
Thank you.
Right? Because when you've got lots of wind and lots of solar, then most of the time you want to shut everything else off to the extent that you can, subject to ancillary, so stability. And so we do not design grids that have a baseload demand and then a power station that meets it. We used to do that in the 20th century. That's now 25 years ago. In fact, even the last 10 years of the 20th century, we didn't do it. So what we need is flexibility. We don't need baseload. We need reliability. We need flexibility. Flexibility can come from demand response from cars and heating. It can come from pumped hydro. It can come from batteries. It can come from, frankly, I've said it, flexible gas peakers for a few percent. I don't care. We just need a bit of flexibility so that you can go out and build lots more clean energy.
I subscribe everything with the exception of the gas peakers, but we'll get into that later. Ben, what's your view on floating offshore wind, and can it boost EU industrial value chain, and can this effect compensate high levelized cost of electricity? Before you reply, there's no such thing as prices on a, let's say, deterministic way. It's all about economical affordability of people and corporates and companies against the cost that it comes up. And so let's stop talking about the absolute price like it's a paradigm. I don't know. Let's talk about economic affordability, because this is how much can we actually pay? How does it impact the full economy? How does it impact electricity consumers? But I don't want to go deeper into this. Ben, please.
Yeah, I guess, just quickly, I mean, first of all, can floating wind boost EU industrial value chain? Yes, it can, undoubtedly. Right? And the studies have been done across the whole supply chain, across ports. You've done these studies in Portugal.
We did.
They've been done across all the European ports, across many economies. So undoubtedly, yes, and it can create industrial investment, infrastructure investment, and job creation. So yes. Does this effect compensate for the higher LCOE? I mean, first of all, as Pedro said, it's about what the alternatives are and what you are comparing to and what else you would do instead, right? And the impact across the economy of that. But I would say, we need to bring the price down. I'm not in favour of just building floating so that we can make things. Do you know what I mean? I wouldn't like to see a high floating, very high cost for floating wind just so that we can build fabrications and foundations and chains and other bits and pieces, right? I don't think that's a good idea.
But there is a learning curve that is being calculated. I know you're a lover of learning curves, and it shows that it can be reduced tremendously.
Exactly, and we need to do that. And at the moment, we're kind of in a bit of a kind of valley where there's not the scale, and so it looks expensive. But we know with fixed bottom offshore that we were able to push through that. I remember being in discussions in the UK about could we possibly bring the price of offshore wind in the UK down to £100 a megawatt hour? And then, a few years later, we were doing auctions at 44, or £50, literally a few years later. So, can we bring the cost down? Absolutely, we can. But it requires scale, and it requires policy constancy, clear direction of travel, and we are very much up for that. And in fact, GWEC is launching a new initiative later this year, really trying to kind of bring the energy and the kind of clear direction of travel back into that floating sector as well.
Well, thank you. We are running out of time. Actually, I'm going to ask the organization to loan me 5 minutes, which I will pay after on another panel. Please, thank you. Because I would like to end with this question for the three of you in 2 minutes each, please. What will the structure of the future renewable-based energy system be? Bruce, we can start with you.
Yeah, the mass deployment of renewable energy will lead to energy abundance at very low cost.
Ezra Klein.
Huh?
That's what I was mentioning, Ezra Klein abundance.
Electrify everything. Ember says you can go north of 75%. I think you can go way further. I think north of 90% is possible. There's just a few process things and flights and a few long shipping routes that may not be electrified. The rest can be electrified. electrify everything with renewable energy. Abundant renewable energy with a flexible demand side that Michael mentioned, with a huge portfolio of wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, whatever that country has a resource. Portugal is a perfect example. It also needs the interconnectors to other countries, if you can do that. And I want to just touch on that question, agility or stability. 100% stability. 20-year high capex investments require stability. The biggest challenge to our industry now is political cycles. I'm not advocating the abolishment of democracy. What I'm saying is that you need 20-year stable policy frameworks. It doesn't actually matter where it is in terms of the ambition. Just stay with the course. Stay with certainty, and we as the private sector will invest. I mean, the future is bright. It's a renewables revolution. We're on board with it, and we lobby strongly that if you don't, you're going to miss out on that huge, abundant opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Ben.
Yeah, I mean, we can build a lot more, and there's plenty of space and there's plenty of resource, and we can bring the cost down with great scale and great efficiency and innovation. I'm not worried about building things. I think it's about pushing through that electrification process where we're seeing in places like Brazil and other places that the demand is not there because a lot of the non-electric sector is still heavily fossil. So we need to push through that. We need to get hydrogen going again as well for some sectors. We need to get
hold on.
There's a bunch of things that need to happen as well between there and there. But my view is building it's not the problem. Creating consistent demand, consistent direction of travel, consistent political cycles. That's what we need. The rest of it, I'm pretty confident about. I know Michael's about to jump on me for hydrogen.
Michael, you have
for
2
hydrogen
minutes.
now, but we'd like to see hydrogen happen in certain places.
I actually thought we got through without using the word hydrogen, and then you blew it, Ben.
It was like no, but
we got so close.
What do you think will be the future base, so the renewable energy based future energy system?
Broadly, I agree. I mean, when I say broadly, I massively agree. I think it's going to be more nuanced. Look, by 2100, we're not going to be burning stuff, or we're not going to be burning fossil stuff. And we're not going to be burning it because it makes no sense from an environmental perspective, of course. It makes no sense from a thermodynamic perspective, and it makes no sense from an economic perspective. But that's 2100. Now the question is, I think I've already said, well, I did already say, you can forget 2050, but now we're just negotiating some time between those. I will say, it will not involve hydrogen as a fuel. It is terrible economics, miles from competitive, and doesn't have the learning curves.
You see, you tease them now.
Every kilowatt hour that you use to make hydrogen is a kilowatt hour, Ben, that you want to use to make hydrogen, but that Bruce needs to use for electrification, which will have 2 to 9 times the beneficial impact. The cleanest kilo of hydrogen, green hydrogen, is the kilo of green hydrogen that you do not make. But that's a sideshow here. I'm really pleased we got nearly to the end without talking about hydrogen. Because it honestly is, whether it's a trivial fuel source or a not at all, is not the question. The question is, this is the major thrust. It's going to be, it's just going to win on the economics. It's going to win on the thermodynamics. It's going to win on the environment, economic, the whole thing, right? But there will be also some nuclear, and there will also be, we haven't talked about it, some bio. We are going to have to also rethink how we use bio in this matrix, even if it's for biogenic carbon removal, because there will be, sectors, aviation and some others, that we cannot do through electrification.
Agreed.
But if I had if I meet Father Christmas and I get one wish, or I become king of the world or whatever, the one thing that I would say is electrification. I'm going to electrify, and you'll accelerate this trend.
Thank you. We'll leave it at here. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel. A round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Está na hora do nosso primeiro intervalo. Convido-vos a tomar um café e a comer qualquer coisa lá fora e voltamos a marcar encontro às 11h30. Obrigado. Até já.
It was fun.